Welcome to my three-part series about upgrading the Teardown Mini Monitor V5s. In part 1, I will be going over the construction of the speaker and my thoughts on the drivers, the crossover, and the enclosure. In part 2, I will be upgrading and rebuilding the crossover with stock values of higher quality components. And in part 3, I will be going over some minor modifications to the enclosure. So, I hope you enjoy this three-part series, and let's get on with part 1. Welcome back. In this video, I have the Teardown Mini Monitor V5. This is the newer version of the Mini Monitor V1 that I did a few months ago, and I'll put a link to that in the description. This is yet another speaker that barely fits into my current filming setup on my desk, but we will make do. This is a 6.5-inch woofer with a 1-inch titanium tweeter. The woofer has a plastic cone material, as well as a not real phase plug as the dust cap, and then has a rubberized surround. Now this plastic, I think, is actually pretty soft. It is not very rigid, and with all this extra mass here from this fake phase plug, it is not the fastest woofer, so it does not do really fast textured bass all that well. However, I think this speaker puts out really nice smooth bass that is excellent for movies. The tweeter on this one is way less harsh and less fatiguing than the tweeter that is on the version 1 of the Teardown Mini Monitor. And I actually really like listening to this speaker. I don't like it for music. I do prefer my Triangle Boreas for music, but I actually prefer these to the triangles for movies. These do movies better than any speaker I've owned before, as far as, like normal bookshelf speakers. So I'll get into disassembling this thing, and I'm going to do it off camera just because it does not really fit. But I will say to take apart this speaker, it's about as easy as it gets. There are 8 of these really large screws that hold in this front plate, and this entire piece of black plastic on the front here is all one piece. The woofer and the tweeter are all one molding. So I'm going to remove this and I'll be right back. All right, that's a little better. You can see, as I said, this whole thing is one big molding. So here are the fasteners they use. These things are gigantic compared to any other speaker. And this was not, this whole thing was not a cheap way to make these speakers. So they definitely cared about what they were doing when they made these. Here is one of the best features of this speaker. The frame is made of injection molded plastic, which on most products is a bad thing, but on speakers is actually a good thing. It also has a ton of venting on the spider, as well as the coil former down there is also vented. So this is a very high quality speaker. The only one of the major features that this thing doesn't have is a vented pole piece. But you know what? They give us plastic here. There's a ton of venting on the spider and on the former in there. So I'll give them a pass on that. Like the Triangle Boreas, this also has silver-plated braided wires for going from the terminals here into the coil of the driver. And then coming to the tweeter, again, it's a titanium dome, so it's a little on the harsh side. But these are, I believe, ferrofluid cooled, which I think that also is supposed to help the dampening and resonance of the the titanium dome, because metal dome tweeters are not as silky smooth as a silk dome. I guess the only other thing to say is that these are, like everything Paradigm makes, made in Canada. So really good quality stuff. This is also a very heavy unit. This is almost the same as the weight of the whole rest of the cabinet. Moving on now to the enclosure. You can see there is plenty of acoustic stuffing. This is also a proper 3/4 inch MDF. I should say, let me rephrase that. This enclosure uses full 3/4 inch MDF for its construction, which is really nice. Most speakers seem to be 5/8. It also has a very thin foam, a closed cell foam gasket for the woofer. The gasket for the tweeter is actually inside the assembly of the tweeter. And you can see, if you look closely in there, a double flared port. And that's really awesome to see. So it's flared on the inside and it's flared on the outside, and that'll really help airflow and minimize chuffing from the port. You'll also notice there's something in here that isn't quite stock, and that is this dowel going forward to aft and one going laterally. And these dowels are in here to make this enclosure more rigid. This is the only thing that I've done that has taken this speaker to be anything but bone stock. So in this series, I won't really be covering how to do this, or I won't be filming it, but I will cover some of the basics of how you can figure out how to install these and make these on your own. Moving on now to the ever controversial crossover. This one is a little bit different. It has a different style of capacitor, and forgive me, I'm not familiar with the exact name of this style of capacitor. It has the Sandcast resistors on standoffs. I'm not sure for what reason. I need to clarify. So I've done two modifications to this speaker. One was the putting the dowels in to brace up the enclosure. The other one is twisting these wires to mitigate any RF interference. It doesn't do a lot, but it does something. You'll see on this iron core inductor, they did try to mitigate any fatigue or rattle from the speaker vibration by putting in some hot glue. The air core inductor actually does use a fairly generous coil size, so maybe that might even be 20 gauge wire, so that's really not too bad. However, it is quite loose on the board, and that will lead to fatigue and cracking at this solder joint over time. Is it likely to happen? No, probably not, but it could, and it's something to consider. And then there's one electrolytic capacitor here. And, for one of these, junky circuit boards that comes in every speaker, this one isn't the worst. The soldering could have been a little better in some spots, but it's hard to get, it's hard to get those perfect. Overall, I'd say it's above average, but not by much. So here's the schematic. The tweeter has an 1/8 watt 0 ohm resistor right out of the gate here, and I think that's just a fuse, or it's just acting like a fuse so that you don't blow up the tweeter. Then you have a 5.6 microfarad capacitor, and then in series with that is a 7.2 ohm resistor. Then in parallel before the resistor is a 1.5 microfarad capacitor, and then a 0.37 millihenry inductor. I haven't seen a capacitor in series with the paralleled inductor before, and I'm gonna take just a wild guess here and say that's for phase reasons, because the phase relationship between the tweeter and the woofer may not have been quite right, and to compensate for that they added a capacitor in series with the inductor. However, this could also just be to change the profile of the frequency response effect that is caused by the inductor. So in my upgraded crossover components, I could not find a single resistor that was 7.2 ohms that I thought was suitable. So I went with a 7 ohm, and the only thing that's going to do is send just a little bit more power to the tweeter. So if you would look at the frequency response curve, let's just assume for a second that it would be perfectly flat. It's going to raise up the tweeter just a little bit. Now, it makes me a little bit nervous because I really like how these sound, and going off the stock values, unless you're able to measure, unless you're able to measure the frequency response of what you're messing around with, if you go off the stock values, you could mess up the way that the crossover works with the drivers. But with 0.2 of an ohm, I don't think that's enough difference to dramatically affect the sound in a negative way. It'll just bring up the tweeter a little bit, and I'm okay with doing that. I'll accept that risk. On the woofer, we have a 1.5 millihenry inductor, and then we have a 2.7 ohm resistor in series with the 22 microfarad capacitor. So if I remember correctly from other research I've done on crossover design, which is, to be fair, not very much, this is here to reduce the effect of the 22 microfarad capacitor. And so again, it's all right, but I've already purchased some upgraded components, and we'll be doing a lot better job than Paradigm did here in the beginning. Quick look at the back plate here. They do have inspectors actually looking at these things, and they do all come with a serial number. So again, these are trackable to some extent or another. Now I just want to give a couple concluding thoughts about these speakers in the way that they sound. These are nothing like the Triangle Boreas that I did a video on about a month or so ago. Maybe it was a couple months ago. The Triangle Boreas are a very soft, unoffensive, beautiful, calming sound as compared to these, where these are a lot more like Klipsch, but if Klipsch had a more refined sound to it. They're a little more punchy and shouty, but they aren't quite as, aggressive as what a Klipsch would sound like. So if you like the sound of Klipsch, if you like how forward they sound, you would probably like these quite a bit because they're very similar. But if you're looking for something that is also a little bit softer and not as fatiguing over long listening periods, I would also recommend giving these a try if you can pick up a set used, or if you want to pick up Paradigm's latest version of these. I think they're on the version 7 right now if you want to buy a new set. So I would recommend these because they're a good middle road between a very crisp, titanium dome tweeter sound and a softer silk dome tweeter sound. Don't get me wrong, they're still on the harsher side of medium, but they're a lot closer to medium than a Klipsch or even the last Paradigms that I reviewed. So with that, I think that concludes part 1. Again, in part 2, I'm going to be going over the building and design process of the new crossover. I will be sticking to all stock components except for that one resistor. And if you follow that, if you just go with whatever the stock values are, you won't run into any issues, and you can really only see improvements. So until then, see ya.